The Cradle says that the UAE has postponed Netanyahu trip over fear of tension with Iran report. This is reportedly the fifth time the Israeli's prime minister's visit to the Gulf state was postponed or canceled. U.S. media outlet Axios released a report on 1 March claiming that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's planned trip to the UAE, which was set for January, was postponed at the start of the month due to the Emirati concerns that the visit would exacerbate regional tensions with Iran, according to the three Zionist occupation officials. Axios states that this was the fifth time an official visit by Netanyahu to the Gulf country was postponed or canceled. Netanyahu had said following his victory in the election that his first foreign trip as prime minister would be to the UAE. This trip was scheduled for the second week of January, Axios says, but following the controversial storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on 3 January by National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Prime Minister's office announced the postponement of the visit. The Prime Minister's aides claimed that the postponement was due to logistics. However, three anonymous Zionist occupier officials who were involved in the planning of the trip were quoted to have said, the Emiratis wanted the visit to focus on celebrating the Abraham Accords and the country's bilateral relationship, but Netanyahu wanted to use the visit as a public signal to Iran. The Emiratis were concerned Netanyahu would give public statements against Iran while on their soil. They didn't want the visit to increase tensions with Iran and decided to postpone it. Axios further cites the Zionist occupiers' sources as saying, Netanyahu's office and two Emirati officials have declined to comment. According to Axios, the Zionist occupying government prime minister understood the situation and is committed to keeping any visit to the UAE focused on bilateral issues. However, following the unprecedented escalation of tensions in recent days, which have been fueled by the Zionists' violence, oppression, and extreme government policies, the schedule of a new visit by Netanyahu to the UAE currently remains delayed. This month, the Emiratis had been planning on drafting and putting to a vote a resolution at the UN Security Council condemning the illegal expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. However, U.S. pressure prompted them to call it off, and Abu Dhabi ended up drafting a presidential statement instead, a less controversial move in the Zionist eyes. Although the UAE remained committed to its relationship with the Zionists, which can't help but be geared towards Iran, Abu Dhabi said, Abu Dhabi also has some positive ties with Tehran, which it seemingly does not wish to fully compromise. This is despite the long-standing territorial dispute between the two nations over 3 Persian Gulf islands, as well as overall regional tension. From Responsible Statecraft, increased regional tensions highlight UAE's balancing act. Abu Dhabi's zero problems foreign policy is being put to the test by the Ukraine war and Israel's quarrels with the Palestinians and Iran. The world's growing multipolarity is allowing the UAE to work both sides of several conflicts, but the sustainability of this approach remains unclear. In particular, by deepening its relations with Israel, the UAE has been able to deflect U.S. pressure to disengage from Iran, Russia, and other countries the U.S. seeks to isolate. Yet, as tensions between Israel and both Iran and the Palestinians mount, Abu Dhabi's efforts to walk a middle path may become increasingly challenging. Last week, the Biden administration appeared to explicitly support Israel's increasingly confrontational conduct against Iran, a position that's likely to increase the risk of wars between the two regional rivals. Meanwhile, the far-right government of the Zionist Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has emboldened Zionist settlers on the West Bank, where they have carried out dozens of attacks against Palestinians. the most recent having taken place in around Nablus, despite last weekend's U.S. mediated emergency meeting in Jordan in which Israel and the Palestinian Authority agreed to de-escalate the ongoing crisis. Netanyahu declared afterwards that the expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank will continue unabated. This escalation in tensions between the Zionists and Iran and Palestinians puts the UAE, which recently renewed diplomatic ties with Iran and is posed as a champion of Palestinian rights, in an increasingly difficult position. If conflict breaks out between Iran and the Zionists, the UAE and the U.S. military base it hosts could find themselves in the crosshairs of Tehran's precision weaponry. At the same time, and in the context of mounting Zionist occupation government violence against Palestinians, the UAE's conspicuous leadership in engaging in ever closer relations with the Jewish state over the last several years risks becoming problematic both domestically and across the Arab world, where public opinion remains hostile to normalization with Zionists. Nonetheless, Abu Dhabi seems determined, at least for now, to maintain ties with Tel Aviv and Tehran, as well as with Moscow, Beijing, and Washington. Under the leadership of President Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, or MBZ, as he is often called, the UAE has committed itself to a zero-problem foreign policy that prioritizes diplomacy and trade over confrontation. In an op-ed in the Saudi paper Sharq al-Awsat, Emirati Foreign Minister Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan used the slogan, "Peace, recovery, and prosperity," to characterize the country's current foreign policy. After 6 years without formal diplomatic contact, the UAE returned its ambassador to Tehran just 6 months ago. Anwar Gargash, MBZ's senior diplomatic advisor, said that the decision to return an ambassador to Tehran aligned with the UAE's policy of pursuing peace, strengthening foreign relations, and pursuing its own path regardless of external pressure. Majed al-Raisi, an Emirati political analyst and strategic communications expert, has consistently said that the UAE will pursue its own national interests and not succumb to Western pressures. Trade and other economic ties with Iran drive much of the UAE's calculus, as Abdul Khalik Abdullah, a UAE national and senior fellow at the Middle East Initiative at the Belfer Center at Harvard Kennedy School, wrote last summer. Restoring UAE-Iran diplomatic relations, the possible signing of a nuclear deal, and more generally, the lessening of regional tensions are all expected to increase trade volume between the UAE and Iran to more than $20 billion annually. The policy of regional outreach, which has also included recent rivals Turkey and Qatar, is a fairly new approach for the UAE in the decade after the Arab Spring. Abu Dhabi often intervened directly, either through its substantial financial resources or through deployment of its own forces, to thwart democratic uprisings and prevent Islamist actors from taking or holding power. Of special concern to the UAE was the rise to power of the Islamist governments in Egypt and Tunisia, which escalated Emirati fears that the Islamists within its own borders would be emboldened. Similarly, the UAE sent troops into Bahrain to help its government quell uprisings there in 2011. The UAE also supported General Khalifa Haftar's 2019-2020 failed military campaign to seize control of Libya from the Turkish-backed and Islamist-affiliated Government of National Accord. Abu Dhabi also sent troops and mercenary forces to Yemen to combat the Iran-backed Houthi movement. The UAE's recent emphasis on rebuilding ties to former adversaries like Turkey and Iran reflects in part its success in thwarting the ambitions of Islamist actors around the region. Having defeated the perceived threat, MBZ appears to have concluded that expanding trade offers more profit than waging war, despite American qualms about some of the UAE's trade partners. In just the last month, top U.S. treaty officials visited Abu Dhabi to warn UAE officials against helping Iran and Russia evade or defy Washington sanctions against the two countries. Specifically, two UAE-based air transport firms have been targeted by Washington for collaborating with a sanctioned Iranian firm by transporting Iranian drones and personnel from Iran to Russia. The UAE had reportedly also been serving as a middleman for Chinese drones shipped to Russia for a deployment in Ukraine. The UAE has had no qualms about working with Russia when it serves its interests. MBZ and Putin held bilateral meetings in October 2022 as part of the UAE strategy of keeping all avenues with potential partners open. Even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Moscow had evaded Western sanctions by using Dubai's gold market to exchange US dollars and euros. The recent sighting in the Dubai marina of the super yacht Madame Gou, which is owned by a sanctioned Russian magnate, Andrei Skoch, offers yet another recent example of the UAE's willingness to assist Russians in evading sanctions. The United States cannot complain too loudly, however, given the UAE's willingness to take the lead in normalizing and developing close relations with Israel under the 2020 Abraham Accords. A memo circulated by the Emirati Embassy in Washington in April 2022 highlighted its $6.5 billion trade with Israel, new agreements for bilateral energy and artificial intelligence cooperation, and its collaboration with Israel on humanitarian assistance. The UAE and other signatories of the Abraham Accords also currently expanding their agreements with the Zionists to include cybersecurity in order to address shared threats, including nation-state targeting of the critical infrastructure and widespread ransomware attacks. The Abraham Accords appear so far to have served Emirati interests well. Although the UAE has condemned violence by the Israeli state against Palestinians in January, its ambassador to the United Nations also led the charge to scrap a draft of a UN Security Council resolution that demanded Zionists immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory. And while just last week Gargash touted the UAE's support for separate UN Security Council presidential statements condemning the construction and expansion of Zionist settlements, his tweet neglected to mention that Abu Dhabi went along with U.S. efforts to prevent the condemnation from becoming a formal Security Council resolution, a more powerful legal instrument. By agreeing to help to block the Security Council's resolution from being voted on enforcing a likely U.S. vote, as well as pursuing a close relationship with the Zionists more generally, the UAE feels able to insulate itself from U.S. pressure on other fronts, notably its engagement with U.S. adversaries like Russia and Iran. At the same time, by drafting and promoting a statement of condemnation, the UAE has so far been also able to insulate itself from pro-Palestinian domestic and regional public opinion. Its performance demonstrates how it can play both sides against the middle. The UAE asserts that it seeks friendship with all nations while pursuing its own geopolitical and economic interests. The UAE's behavior in sometimes supporting U.S. policies and at other times thwarting them is likely to become more common in this geopolitical context of multipolarity. Meanwhile, as hostility escalates from Jerusalem to Tehran to Moscow, it remains to be seen how long the UAE will be able to maintain its zero problems foreign policy. Well, they're trying, but that is a blatant contradiction, right?
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
And from memo, UAE canceled Netanyahu visit fearing he would say something against Iran. The United Arab Emirates canceled Zionist occupation government Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's planned visit in January due to his concerns his conduct during the visit could increase regional tensions with Iran, the Walla news site reports, citing 3 Zionist occupation government officials with the knowledge of the matter, the Times of Israel reported. According to the report, the Prime Minister's office has said the visit was canceled for logistical reasons. The officials tell the outlet that the Emiratis wanted the visit to focus on the Abraham Accords and bilateral relations, but that they feared Netanyahu wanted to use the visit to speak publicly against Iran. And watch this space. Remember, your engagement by way of a like, share, or subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
he's the most simple-minded that Loci is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Well, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever
The
occur
whole
to you they
notion
might
of
react
logic.
emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
The whole notion of logic.
Unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which
The
I
whole
find
notion
eminently
of
satisfactory,
logic.
Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand
whole
how we feel
notion
about
of
our life
logic.
here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I am chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer.